now begin the second session of the 2016 International Modeling Conference. This session consists of presentations on the future of the carbon markets and their interconnection, market stability reserve, price controls, and other options to stabilize EU ETS prices, and EU ETS lessons learned and future plans. After the presentations, there will be a round-table discussions with 3 presenters and another 2 panelists. First of all, we would like to invite Mr. Luca Taschini from London School of Economics to give us a presentation titled The Future of Carbon Markets and Their Interconnection. Please welcome Mr. Luca Taschini with a big round of applause.
So thanks a lot. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here and have an opportunity to present some of the work we are doing at the LSE on carbon markets. So let me also take this opportunity to congratulate with GR for the effort in organizing such a fantastic event with a terrific list of attendants. I'm really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have later on during the panel. So I would like to take the opportunity first to introduce the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE, give you a bit of overview of what we're doing at the Grantham, so that in case you want to engage with us on other front of our research agenda. So the Grantham Research Institute is a multidisciplinary research institute funded by the Grantham family, the Grantham Foundation, and the ESRC, that is the the Economic Social Research Council, and it's chaired by Lord Stern. So we have a relatively wide spectrum of research in our portfolio. We can broadly categorize ourselves into 2 main pillars. One is the climate change adaptation, and the second one is climate change mitigation, and it obviously belongs to the second. In particular, myself, I'm leading one specific research program that is called Carbon Trading and Finance. And within this program, for the past 8 years, or 9 years, we've been doing quite a lot of research on design, mechanism design, market design. And we've been engaging with policymakers in Europe predominantly, but we also had experiences with policymakers in Australia, California, and a lot of work with colleagues in China, especially in the design and analysis of the Shanghai and Guangzhou system. We've been also doing some work on carbon market oversight, and what I will present today is our most recent work on linking and interconnection of international markets. So we also do quite a lot of work on energy economics, but I will just park that and just move on with the presentation. So what I want to discuss is one of our recent paper on what we call carbon dating. Dating stands for the idea of 2 different ETS date one each other, so interconnection. I will definitely not go into the details of the paper. I'm pretty sure that if you're interested, the paper is online, you can read that. But I would like to give you a very high overview of what are the main motivations of our work and the major findings of our work. And I think at the end of the day, you will see it's good news for the South Korean ETS. So I'll start with a very brief overview of the international carbon markets. And then I would like to motivate the work in terms of why linking. Why do we care about linking? What are the different motivation, economic and political motivation that make linking so important? And then would like also to say something about the potential barriers for linking, and those are obviously connected to practical considerations that we need to take into account when it comes to thinking about which is the potential partner, which is the potential ETS you would like to link to. And then I will go into the main findings and analysis we have done for the past 2 years. The paper is not just about linking, is about where or exactly what are the conditions that make linking beneficial, not just at the aggregate level for the two different parties. I will just focus on the link between two different jurisdictions, but also looking at linking from the single perspective of one of the two jurisdictions. So sometimes you might have a link that is in aggregate terms, overall beneficial, and most of the links are actually beneficial when costs of linking are negligible. Sometimes one of the two parties may find that link not extremely beneficial. And the paper itself basically helps you to answer a very basic question, which is a good partner? So in a way, you can discriminate between good and better links. And then I will try to give you a very simplified version of the empirical analysis that we have in the work, in the paper. And I will try to bring the carbon dating, the model, to the data, and tells you something about the perspective of the different regulated jurisdiction that we took into account, and think about what are the options for the South Korean ETS. And then eventually, at the very end, I would like to conclude the presentation with some points about what are the existing links and how they materialize. And I will briefly mention the three major initiatives that are currently discussed around the world. One initiated by the World Bank, another one by the WTO, and conclude with some points connected to Paris Agreement. Okay, so international carbon markets. Good news is that carbon markets are, the use and implementation of carbon markets is increasing exponentially, I would even say. So as of now, the World Bank identifies one big region, European Union, consisting of 31 nations, whether UK will stay in or not, I don't know. 31 nations that are regulated under the EU ETS. We've got 8 individual nations that already implement an ETS, and 23 different sub-national jurisdictions implementing ETS. So we have really quite many different jurisdictions at the national, sub-national, or supranational level. You can think also about the international aviation sector as a supranational jurisdiction, or the maritime sector. So quite substantial, relevant number of existing and implemented or about to be implemented ETSs. So that definitely gives us some hope, or we can assume that given the large number of ETSs, we could observe ETSs to play a much more bigger role in integrating all the different policies and becoming a component, a very important component of the future policy, climate change policy architecture. So when it comes to linking, we know that there are a lot of ETSs, but frankly, there are not that many links. So let's try to understand why. What is the reason for not having or not observing that many links? So let's first think about why linking. So the very basic question is, why should I link? So there are clearly two basic motivations, economic and political motivation. So the first one is connected to the fact that if you link, if you have two different jurisdictions that link, what you will observe is a larger, what you will provide is a wider spectrum of abatement opportunities. So regulated entities, regulated actors will be able to tap into a broader set of abatement opportunities. And that means that you can, the wider is the spectrum, the larger is the universe of abatement options, you could assume that is connected to cheaper abatement, overall cheaper abatement compliance costs. Then obviously, the bigger, the larger is the pool of firms that are regulated, the larger is going to be the liquidity of the system. And that obviously has, again, a beneficial impact on the ETS itself. You can think about an ETS as not necessarily just a market, it's actually a design market. And in such a design artificial market, you need to think about what are the costs for a regulated entity to interact, to basically play the game that is ETS. And if you have a relatively small pool of firms, if the firms are facing very high costs of transacting, well, they will they will marginally play that game, and that means that the cost effectiveness of your policy will not be that high. So larger liquidity, lower, again, transaction costs. And then depending, and I will talk about that, depending on who's going to be your partner in the link, you might also observe overall lower volatility of the price. Most of the literature, academic literature, pre-assume that as soon as you have a link, the variability, the volatility of the price will decrease. I will try to justify or explain you that that's not necessarily the case. And by the way, higher volatility is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, political motivation. Well, you can think about those as locking in effects. So linking locks in ETS as one of the local regulatory choices for controlling emissions. And that means that you actually capture the risk of regulatory, you actually reduce the risk of regulatory capture. So as soon as you link, and we saw the presentation by Morgan, as soon as you link, the ultimate reflection of a link will be a convergence in prices, obviously, right? Depending on whether you've got unlimited link or limited link, that might actually mitigate and reduce that convergence or actually block at some point that conversion. But ideally, you would like to see full convergence of prices. And as soon as prices converge, that means that you are actually guaranteeing a level playing field. So as soon as you've got linking, that alleviates all concerns connected to competitiveness among the different economics. So those are the two major, I believe, the two major groups of motivation that I would define as economic and political. And there are actually practical considerations that need to be taken into account. And that is the practicality, those are connected to the practicality of integration, of merging or connecting, or interlinking, depending on what exactly is the consideration you're taking. So the practical considerations are pretty much connected to compatibility and the very need of identifying systems that are in a way homogeneous under some respect. So the first compatibility aspect that you want to consider is by looking at the monitoring, reporting, and verification design system, and also the registry system. Those, I believe, are relatively simple to adjust, or in a way to harmonize. Is purely an accounting exercise, if you like. Now, there are other design aspects of the ETSs that are not that simple in terms of homogenizing. There is the enforcement and penalty mechanism and cost containment mechanism. So think about two ETSs, one implementing a price ceiling, the other one not implementing a price ceiling. As soon as the two ETSs are linked under a form of unlimited link, well, the one that is not starting without a price ceiling will automatically adopt a price ceiling by basically simply being connected to the other one. So there is a transfer of some of the element of the design system that may be problematic, maybe not. So at the end of the day, what is the key aspect you want to consider is which is my ideal partner. So when you are looking for, if you go back to the map of ETSs and you have in front of you a relatively large set of possible partners, which one is the one that actually fit you the best? And in some respects, the existing link we observe, I think are the one exactly between ETSs that are the most compatible, the one that actually minimize the costs of linking. But I don't think this is necessarily a barrier. But let's look at the experience. The experience so far of linking is between California and Quebec. Both ETSs, in a way, are designed under a common platform, the WCI, the Western Climate Initiative, and that obviously massively minimize the costs of linking. My considerations go beyond that. So there are not just costs to take into account, but are also benefits of linking. It may be possible that Canada California and Quebec, that particular link is certainly very cheap from the point of view of the cost of linking, but maybe giving very low benefits. And let me elaborate on that. Carbon dating. So carbon dating is the whole idea of gains from trade. So as soon as you have two ETSs that operate independently, well, you know there is a missing opportunity. And that missing opportunity is precisely connected to the fact that if the companies are not allowed to exploit price differential, that means that there will be foregone benefits. So the whole idea is purely based on, as soon as you connect the two systems, you can exploit that price differential, and that means that you have gains coming from trade. So that is precisely what we investigated in our paper. The title is Carbon Dating, When is it beneficial to link ETSs? And in that paper, we are basically examining what are the different factors, the key factors that are characterizing the benefits of linking, and try to answer to the question, what does make a good carbon trade? So first, results, opposites attract. So what we mean by opposite attract, we took the model to the data, we calibrate the model to major countries, including implementing ETSs or about to implement ETSs, including South Korea, China, Europe. We also included the aviation sector, the maritime sector. And then we tried to identify, using our different criteria that are basically variability, dependence between the economies, and the relative size of the regulated economy. We tried to identify how these different components make up for the total benefit in linking and the single country or jurisdiction-specific benefits. Now, what we observe is that, as I said, opposites attract. So if you look at the, I think this, this here, you see US and Europe. So that is a potential link between Europe and US. And on the y-axis, we have the total benefit of that potential link, and on the x-axis, we have what we call the sum of these two different effects, the variability effect and the dependence effect. And although these two ETSs are relatively large, because the two regulated economy are so dependent and very, the emissions related to that regulated economies are relatively stable, not that variable, the overall benefit is not that large. What you will observe is that whenever we're considering link where Korea is a potential partner, well, the overall aggregate benefit is much, much larger. And we also discuss the jurisdiction-specific, the benefit from the point of view of the regulated, of a single jurisdiction in a moment. So opposite attracts. So you want a country, you prefer a partner to be, whose emissions are relatively variable and not in sync with you. That means that when my demand is up, your demand should be down, right? Now, another component, the last component of the three, is the market size. Market size is also another important aspect of the total aggregate benefits. And what we observe is that as soon as you consider the connection, the link of two ETSs, the smaller one, the smallest of the two, actually tend to gain the most. So you will, if you have a potential link between, say, China and South Korea, of the total benefit coming from that link, actually South Korea is the one gaining the most. And then again, this makes our analysis very relevant, because whenever you have to consider interlink, you have to consider the relative size of the different ETSs. Now, this is also the point I was mentioning about the costs, so getting off to a good start. That means that whenever you're considering negotiating costs, harmonization costs, all these aspects will have a cost that you have to take into account. If linking costs are too high, well, that will definitely put off the possibility of linking. What we do can assume is that if you've got ETSs that in a way they are similar in terms of design, cost of negotiation may be negligible. Or if you have countries implementing ETSs that are relatively alike in terms of institutional proximity, you might also assume that costs are relatively low. So, and that's why we could consider those costs as a reasonable justification of why negotiation between, for example, Europe and China still at the very early stage. There are too many costs to face in terms of negotiation and harmonization and things like that, as opposed to the case of Europe and Switzerland, where if you look at the costs, I know that the benefits are really small because the Swiss system is super small compared to the European one. We're talking about 60 entities versus 11,000 entities, but the negotiation costs were basically zero, nothing. So still a positive benefit. Now, as I said, we took the model to the real world. I will show you now a specific result that is for the aviation system, the aviation sector. I want to do that because the aviation sector recently adopted the idea of adopting a market-based system. And what I would like to show you is that when we consider the different benefits of linking between large and similar markets, those are usually dwarfed when they are compared to small but different markets. That means that sometimes, even if you have two relatively small ETSs, they might generate overall a much larger benefit compared to the larger size ETSs. So obviously there are assumptions that are intrinsic in the calibration of the model. I believe, together with my co-author, that they are not outlandish. The model is really simple to calibrate, and is simply calibrated to the dynamics, so the time series of the emission. That allows us to compute these characteristics of the different ETSs that at the end of the day are variability of the emissions, correlation between the emissions, and the psi itself is just the total amount of emissions that are regulated. Now, exactly for the reason that sometimes smaller but different markets are better than larger connection, what I will show you is that if you look at the South Korean ETS, well, actually that turns out to be a very interesting potential partner for very many existing and to be implemented ETSs. So the graph here shows the total benefit. Those are the blue bar here, and the benefit from the point of view of a specific jurisdiction. In this particular case is the aviation jurisdiction. So the we are plotting the different benefits in decreasing order from the point of view of the aviation sector. So as you can see, the aviation sector would rather prefer, the red bar is the largest here, would rather prefer to link with, I believe, China. But from a social perspective, from a perspective where you look at the total benefits of aviation plus a second ETS, you will see that actually the largest one of the largest is with South Korea. We also introduced Egypt here just to show the real effect of a country that is totally asynchronous with respect to the existing ETS. So this is, I think, is relatively a good sign in terms of South Korea could be a very interesting potential linking partner. So example of links. There are relatively few. The one that I would like to consider or just to mention are the California and Quebec. A link is a two-way link. California accepts for full as a fully compliant Quebecian permits, and Quebec does exactly the same with respect to California. Mind you that de facto those allowances are not really different. They are issued exactly by the same authority, so they are in fact equivalent under all different respects. Another type of link that I would mention is a sort of multilateral link, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the United States. Europe and Norway was a unilateral link at the very beginning. Norway was accepting European allowances in terms of buying European allowances, and now Norway is in fact, in practice, part of the European system. And then we had an intended link between Australia and Europe that was initially again intended to be a one-way, and the European and the Swiss is again a two-way. Now, notice that most of these are unrestricted link. There are no restriction whatsoever here, because definitely, as we heard in the previous panel, imposing some sort of discounting factor or limitation, quality and quantity limitation, may be really a very difficult process that will definitely make linking less likelihood outcome. Now, a note on the Paris Agreement. And more importantly about the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement contemplates three broad mechanisms. What is relevant, I think, for this talk is the first one, the cooperative approaches on a voluntary basis. Why is this relevant? Well, because that actually implies a decentralized mechanism that allows voluntary bilateral and multilateral linkages of markets. For example, the whole idea about carbon clubs. So that also, I think, is relatively important because it connects to the whole idea of the ITMO, the Internationally Transferable Mitigation Outcomes, that not necessarily should be assumed to be purely allowances. So if you think about ITMO, that could be also something different, not just allowances. Could be renewable certificates, could be energy efficiency certificates. So when it comes to linking, we should not just necessarily narrow our focus on ETSs. That could be also within, for example, the Korean ETS could be between the Korean jurisdiction, could be between a link, could be the one between the ETS and the renewable market of the energy efficiency market. That's exactly what China is currently considering at the national level. So now let me approach the conclusion with a mention about different initiatives. The first one is the initiative by colleagues at RFF, the Resource for the Future, Dallas Butrov and Clayton Mannings. So they are discussing the possibility of a link, of an idea of linking by degrees. That's a concept that I like a lot. The whole idea is you have a process of incremental alignment of different program elements, and that probably is a relatively quite promising avenue, where you have different ETSs, perhaps highly incompatible, but slowly will move towards a high level of compatibility by aligning some of their program elements. And then on middle and your right-hand side, you have the initiatives that are tossed around by the New Climate, the Network Market Initiative for the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization is involved as well, and a few other academics. They're talking about this idea of network carbon markets and clubs of carbon markets. Their idea basically moves away from the assumption where ETSs need to link necessarily. The whole idea is there might be some sort of network where under very loose restriction or very loose, imposing very loose compatibility requirements, the different ETSs could cooperate together, sharing knowledge or really trading permits. Now, let me conclude. So the main message here is that there is always a missing opportunity when markets operate independently. And that means that linking is always beneficial, regardless. It's always beneficial to link with another ETSs. But there are obviously aspects that need to be taken into account. First of all, costs of negotiation, cost of linking. That could immediately eat up all the benefits of linking. If costs are relatively negligible, then there are other aspects that need to be taken into account. And those other aspects are related to the characteristics of the economies that are regulated. What I explain you is that our research shows that opposite attracts, so you would like to link to the ETS that is most different compared to your ETS, if you like, and the size, the market size of the linking partner matters. So you would like to link to the ETSs that are larger than your ETS. We took that theoretical prediction in a way to the data, and we show that large and similar markets can be actually dwarfed by those links that are between small but different markets. So there is definitely a very wide heterogeneity in the econometric results that might give very interesting futures outcome. And that precisely means that South Korea could be a very interesting potential partner. Exactly for the characteristic that the Korean economy has with respect to the other existing and to be implemented ETSs. And then the very last point, maybe a positive note, is that with the Paris Agreement being now ratified, I think this certainly opens a new era in terms of international climate action. And for sure, given the Article 6, gives a very strong support for interconnection of ETSs. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Luca Taschini, for your wonderful presentation. Next, Mr. Harrison Fell from North Carolina State University will give us a presentation on market stability reserve, price controls, and other options to stabilize EU ETS prices. Please welcome Mr. Harrison Fell with a big round of applause.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. So I'm going to talk about some of the policies that have already been discussed here, in particular policies aimed at trying to get these carbon market prices a little bit more stable. So just to start, I think probably everyone here is fairly well aware that the EU ETS prices plotted here have been pretty variable over the last 7-8 years. So 5 years ago or so we're around 20 to 25 euros, and now we're around 5 euros a ton. And because of this volatility, the success of the EU ETS has taken a bit of a beating in the press. So there's been quite a few popular press articles, and I just grabbed a few quotes from 3 that popped up when I just Googled it. There's this general idea that if we have prices too volatile or prices too low, that must mean that the EU ETS is not working. Now, I would somewhat push back against this, and in my discussion with European colleagues and European officials, one does have to realize what is the goal of a cap-and-trade system. If the goal of the cap-and-trade system is to cap emissions, the EU ETS is still working. Is it getting you the price that you want to see, or the stability in the price that you want to see? Maybe not, but are emissions from the regulated sectors still capped? Yes, they are. But regardless, that does this thought that the volatility is bad and that it's meaning the system doesn't work, or that the low prices are bad and that means the system doesn't work, is a reality in the minds of some, and that forces some actions from regulators. It's also probably worth noting that the EU ETS is not alone in this volatility and low price issue. If you look at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a trading program in the northeastern U.S. among electricity, in the electricity sector among states in the northeastern U.S., the line with the triangles here is the price of permits at the different auctions they had here, and you can see that that at the beginning, or this in the beginning, this is partway through, but early on in the program, the prices were hovering around the price floor, which was set at around $2, and then it bounced around in recent auctions, going all the way up to almost 8, and then halving 2 auction later. So quite a bit of volatility in the Reggie market. There's also been quite a bit of volatility in some of the original emissions trading markets, which were the sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide trading programs in the U.S. These were among the first cap and trade programs ever implemented anywhere. And you can see that the prices of these programs over time really fluctuated quite a bit. And now they're effectively zero, but that's because they're more or less done. They moved on to a different regime. Okay, so given that we have all of this volatility, what can policymakers do, and what have they done? So policymakers have considered several different options. One, we could put in permit price collars, so some sort of price floor and some sort of price ceiling. This has been done in Reggie. This has been done in California's cap and trade system, and in the proposed U.S. Federal cap and trade systems in 2008, 2009, some sort of collar was basically a part of all the programs. We could adjust the value of the banked permits if we feel that the prices are too low. And I should say, backing up a step here, generally the problem that most have complained about isn't the high side volatility and prices being too high, it's that prices are too low. So these are sort of somewhat different problems, volatility and too low prices. So I'm sort of talking around sort of 2 different points here, but we can think about these sort of price control mechanisms in general. So one of the things that regulators have done to deal with too low prices is effectively adjust the value of banked permits. So either vacate some of the banked permits, or say now that banked permits are only worth half of a ton of emissions. This was actually one of the proposed things in the USSO2 policy, and Reggie actually vacated some of the banked permits. We could adjust the cap in later years. Reggie did this as well, so they basically just said we're going to lower the cap in the future to try to help increase prices. And some sort of form of this was also done in EU ETS with its backloading program. And then finally, the sort of newest kid on the block here in terms of policies to sort of stabilize prices and to prevent against lower prices in particular is something called the Market Stability Reserve, which has been brought up earlier today, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that is. So what have I done in my analyses? I basically develop a dynamic stochastic model and then parameterize that to the EU ETS under some of the things that Jorn was talking about earlier, this modeling effort that DIW convened a year or so ago. And I use that model to analyze the different the relative efficiencies of these different policies. Okay, so always a dangerous thing to do at 5 in the afternoon, but I'm going to put up some equations here, so bear with me. I'm an economist, so I can't do a talk without some equations. So the stochasticity in this model comes through stochastic outcomes with regards to baseline or business as usual emissions. So we have abatement as the difference between our baseline emissions, which is this Q bar plus theta, and theta is this random element, and our abatement is the baseline emissions minus what we actually emit, which is QIT. Okay, so we're going to assume that there's some sort of shock to baseline emissions. This is going to give us the volatility that we need to be able to analyze price control mechanisms aimed at reducing volatility. We have an abatement cost function, I'll get into some of the details about how that was formed. Well, I'm not going to gloss over the details about how that's formed. We've heard enough about how this is the nitty-gritty of that already today, so I won't go into that as well. The firm can buy permits in an auction at price P. They can also bank permits to use in future periods. And so basically, the minimization problem that I have for an individual firm is effectively going to minimize abatement costs plus the purchase of permits, subject to the ability to bank permits for future years. And this is all over some fixed time period of a policy horizon. Okay, so if you do all that, what falls out? Some really basic points that those of you familiar with this literature already know, which is basically what you get from doing that minimization problem is that firms are going to want to emit up to the point where the abatement cost today is equal to the expected abatement cost tomorrow, discounted. So that's what that beta does. It's a discount factor. And also correcting for the fact that there might be some limit to the amount of permits that can be borrowed. And what this ends up resulting in is that we should see expected prices of permits rising at the discount rate R, corrected for the possibility that you might be up against a borrowing constraint. Okay, so this is a result that pops out of a lot of different papers, so nothing new there. But I use that result when I do the numeric simulation. So this is the backbone of basically the numeric simulations. This is how I determine how much emissions we get in each period. This is the effective rules that a firm, or in my case, the representative firm is using. Okay, so now to the policy scenarios. So it's important to note that basically all of these policy scenarios are different ways to affect the allocation in any given period. All right? And we also know that the purchase of permits across all the firms is going to be equal to that allocation, or I'm going to assume that. And so what we really want to know then is basically how many permits are going to be allocated each period, and then I can set this up in a representative firm framework. Okay, so how does the market stability reserve affect the allocation of permits? So the allocation of permits next period is going to be what was stated as the allocation minus if we're over some sort of aggregate bank limit. So if the aggregate bank held by all the firms is above some predetermined upper threshold where the policy, the regulators determine what that upper level is going to be, then we're going to subtract off some of that stated allocation. If the bank limit is below, if the bank is below some predetermined limit, then we're going to add some permits into the allocation next period, right? So again, basically what we're doing is we're going to adjust the cap next period. If we cross some upper limit bank threshold, then we're going to not give away as many permits. And if on the other hand, we're below some lower limit threshold, we're going to add some more to the permits. Okay, so how does that differ from the permit price collar? So in the permit price collar, we have a similar sort of, we have a stated allocation, and then we can either add some or we can subtract some. So in the permit price world, in the permit price collar world, we're going to add some additional permits to the allocation if the price would exceed some upper bound price. So if we go across the price ceiling, then the regulator starts throwing permits into the market to keep the prices down. On the other hand, if the price is going to be too low, the regulator, you can either think about the regulator either buying permits back, or if you're thinking about all of the permits being auctioned, you can think about this being implemented via some sort of price floor in the auction. Okay, so the cap here is being adjusted based on the price of the permits, whereas in the market stability reserve, the allocation is being adjusted based on how many permits are being held in the bank, right? So one of these is a price-based updating scheme. One of these is a bank-based updating scheme. And then finally, the last scenario that we look at, or I look at here, is just a permit reduction policy. So if you're concerned about the price being too low, the simplest thing to do is just don't allocate so many permits, right? Flat out reduce the permit allocation. So I assume that the allocation in any given period is some fraction of what was stated as the allocation when the policy was originally set up. And I model that in two different ways. One where there's a flat reduction in every single period going forward, and the other where we just vacate some of the allocation in the latter years. Both of these types of systems have been considered and implemented in different policy regimes. Okay, so solving all of that analytically with the uncertainty is a bear. It's basically intractable. So I use a numeric simulation to compare these different policies. That numeric simulation is parameterized to the EU ETS. So I use the actual EU ETS stated allocation from 2014 to 2050, including the backloading plan for those of you really familiar with the ETS. The business as usual emissions and the marginal abatement cost curves come from a CGE modeling framework, which was discussed earlier. The market stability reserve policy that I use is based off of some of the proposals that the European Commission put forward. In particular, we have the upper banking corridor at 0.833 billion tons, and the banking corridor is set up between 0.4 and 0.833 billion tons, or billion permits. And then importantly, the 0.12 means that if we cross the upper limit of the banking threshold, then tomorrow's allocation is going to be 12% of what that bank is, right? So we're going to reduce the allocation by 12% of what the held bank is. On the low end, what this is saying is that we're going to kick in 10% more permits if the bank falls below that lower bank threshold. And then the remaining policies that I explore here are designed such that they give the same expected emissions as the MSR. Okay, so the market stability reserve is sort of going to be our straw man here, and then everything else is going to be relative to that. Okay, so what are some of the outcomes right away? So what this chart is telling you is the emissions for each of these different policies, and then in the brackets are the 95% confidence intervals. Again, there's stochasticity in the emissions of these policies, at least for the price collars and for the MSR there is. So the price collars relative to the MSR are going to deliver at the same expected emissions level. They're going to deliver lower expected abatement costs. So it's a little bit more cost efficient. On the other hand, if we do these straight permit reduction policies, that is, if we just vacate some of the permits, we strictly just don't allocate as much, we have fixed emission outcomes, but at a higher cost, right? So the trade-off here is that basically with the collars, we can get the expected cost to go down, but we have a little bit more variability in the emissions. With these reduction in permit allocation policies, we can get the exact emissions level, but we're going to do that at a higher cost. A couple of other things, again, since this is really what we're concerned here about is, to some degree, what I'm motivating this with is price stability. The plots here are the different price paths in the solid line and the 95% confidence intervals in the dashed line. So this is the basic case, and you can see there's quite a bit of a range, particularly in the later years, of potential price outcomes. If we use the market stability reserve here in this scenario, that range tightens a lot, particularly in the mid-years. It can kind of explode out here, and I'll show you a little bit why in a couple of slides. This all has to do with where the bank is. if we do a collar, obviously the collar is going to, by its nature, restrict the price movement in between the collar. So that's what this is showing. And then if we do the permit price, if we do the permit reduction policies, again, we have fairly wide range. So basically, the MSR does better at protecting against the low price outcomes than the permit reduction policy. So another way of saying that is, if you're really worried about prices getting too low, strictly erasing some of the permits in the latter years might not protect against that. It all depends upon the shock outcomes. Another important thing to consider here is that the Market Stability Reserve really adjusts the allocation based on the cumulative bank level, and that cumulative bank level is going to be very sensitive to the assumed discount rate, right? So we bank, one of the main drivers of the bank is to equalize that marginal abatement cost, discounted marginal abatement cost across periods, right? So whatever discount rate we use is really going to affect the bank path, right? So, so this blue line here is with a 3% discount rate, and this dotted line here is with a 15%. So we bank a heck of a lot less under this higher discount rate. As a result, that's going to have major implications for how many permits the Market Stability Reserve is going to take out of the system. And in particular, what I find here is that as we increase the discount rate, the Market Stability Reserve takes fewer and fewer permits out of the system. And the reason is that as you increase the discount rate, you're going to lower the amount of banking you're going to do. If you lower the amount of banking you're going to do, you're not going to cross that upper threshold as much. If you don't cross that upper threshold very often, then there's no mechanism to take permits out of the system. Right? On the other hand, with a collar world, the total emissions in expectation actually decline as you increase the assumed discount rate. And this is because you're more likely to hit the floor in this world where you have a higher discount rate. Okay, so what are the conclusions here? Basically, stability in these cap and trade systems has been and continues to be an area of concern for policymakers, right? And in particular, there seems to be a real concern over the apparent over-allocation and the problem from too low of prices rather than the problem of too high of prices. So I analyzed the set of different policies aimed at trying to stabilize this and or avoid this permanent over-allocation problem. And basically, the findings is that we can design a price collar to achieve the same expected emissions level as the MSR or as the policies to reduce permits altogether, and that can get us to the same expected levels at a lower expected cost. Another key finding here is that the MSR, the effectiveness of the MSR is really dependent upon the assumed discount rate. And if you have high discount rates, it's really not going to remove that many permits if that's your sort of underlying goal. And then finally, the design of the MSR can also greatly impact its ability to stabilize prices and protect against over-allocation. So where you set that banking corridor is very important, right? And so where you set that upper and lower limit matters a lot to how effective the MSR is at being able to stabilize prices. I'm going to stop there, and if you have any questions, I can state those later.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison-Fell, for your wonderful presentation. Lastly, Mr. Alistair Leach from Leach Polish Consulting Ltd. will give us a presentation on EU ETS lessons learned and future plans. Please welcome Mr. Alistair Leach with a big round of applause.
Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here at this conference and So in my presentation this afternoon, I'll be summarizing some of the latest lessons learned from the EU ETS experience, and also looking ahead to Phase 4, 2021 to 2030. So we've heard today about lots of interesting topics on sort of carbon market modeling and linking and things like that. And as you know, the EU ETS is the benchmark for emissions trading systems, given it's the longest established, it's the largest, and it's had the most experience of looking back and looking forward in terms of refinement. So I'll start off by talking a bit about the evaluation process that is carried out in the EU, and then I'll summarize some of the main findings of that evaluation, and then talk about some of the changes that are planned for Phase 4 as a result of that process. And then finally, I'll talk about, we heard earlier about how to measure the effectiveness of an ETS, and I'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing recently on that topic. And then I'll finish off with the key lessons learned. So the evaluation process in the EU is quite well refined, and the framework is applied to all policies. And this example shows how the framework is applied to the EU ETS and how it was applied in a project we did recently. You can take the same framework and apply it to the different technical building blocks within the ETS. I think the interesting things to kind of take from this is that you kind of need to step back and think, well, what does the ETS really need to achieve? What was the original objective? What needs was the objective trying to satisfy? What intervention was planned? What were the intended impacts? But what maybe are some of the unintended impacts? I think some of the key points from this relate to the external factors like economic growth, competition. Economic growth was a major external factor that's the source of all this discussion about MSR, for example. Intended impacts, clearly reductions in GHG emissions, but also cost to enterprises is an intended impact of ETS. You can't expect industry to have no cost of contributing to an 80% reduction in GHG by 2050. So I think that the negotiation with industry needs to be, this is a costed policy, but it's a lower cost than alternatives. And I think we all pretty much understand the cost effectiveness theory of an ETS, but sometimes industry expects to have zero cost and expects there to be no impact. I think also unintended impacts, I think, relate to particularly competitiveness. That needs to be protected, and there need to be measures to guard against carbon leakage and adverse competitiveness impacts. And I think I'll be coming to that later with like free allocation, and that's become more important in EU to protect highly competing industries from adverse effects where there's not a level playing field of climate policy. With the KETS and next year with the national ETS in China, there's a huge step forward in leveling the playing field and reducing the carbon leakage risk. And then finally, there's a delicate balance between windfall profits by giving industry that can pass through carbon costs into their products, maybe 50% or 80%, but still gets 100% free allocation, is likely to get a windfall profit. So there's a trade-off, a delicate balance between protecting against competitiveness impact through free allocation, but equally not overcompensating and giving too much. And that's a problem we've had in the EU ETS. So that's just kind of the framework for the evaluation and that you have in your slides. But the main findings of the evaluation were the key strengths of the emissions trading system is environmental integrity. The cap, the reduction, the emissions are guaranteed. The MRV system is the mechanism to achieve that cap, and That's the major advantage of the ETS. The carbon market has been established, the carbon price has evolved, carbon costs are internalized into product prices, and there's a robust infrastructure. So the MRV system within EU ETS is recognized as an international best practice. It's evolved over multiple years and involved a lot of consultation with industry. The major weaknesses which we've been hearing about is the low carbon price. So the low carbon price is a problem because it doesn't provide enough incentive to industry to invest in the longer term low carbon technology to avoid carbon lock-in and a more expensive economic impact in the long run. And then also political and regulatory uncertainty. So we've heard about volatility of carbon prices. The market is a volatile place itself, but that's made worse if there's uncertainty on what policy will happen, delays in making decisions, and one of the benefits of recent ETS changes has been the long trading period, the long-term cap, so industry, which is investing for 20, 30 years, can make their decisions. The main areas for further improvement relate to the Market Stability Reserve, cap setting, free allocation, and also funding mechanisms for low-carbon technology. The Market Stability Reserve, I won't say too much about that because you've already had presentations. So clearly the problem is the mismatch between the fixed supply and the variable demand. So MSR is trying to create some flexibility in the supply and to address issues of low carbon prices and the vulnerability of the system to economic shocks. So this chart simply shows, I guess, the surplus accumulating since the economic recession in 2008, 2009, and the corresponding decline in the carbon price as the supply-demand balance changed. And this slide simply shows a representation of the thresholds that we've heard about, the trigger points. And I think one of the strengths of the MSR is the transparency and the rule-based system. So everybody knows at what point intervention will happen and how much intervention will happen. And also, there was a debate in the EU about price-based versus volume-based trigger points. And the conclusion was that because it's a volume-based policy, the trigger points should be volume-based. There's a lot of factors outside the control of the policymaker that affect the carbon price, like international energy prices and lots of other factors. So that was the rationale. The cap is, as you know, is a politically developed element, but with the intention of helping to achieve the long-term GHG mitigation objectives. So the pace of decline of the cap will accelerate from 2021, and that will help to reduce some of the surplus of allowances. The free allocation, so free allocation was originally envisaged as a transitionary measure on the road to full auctioning. I guess it still is, but even up to 2030, there will be free allocation, and for carbon leakage sectors, that will be 100% of their allocation. Other sectors will get 30%. So the role of free allocation methodologies is very important. So the BM values that were originally developed in 2009, 2010 are planned to be updated through reflecting technological progress. The BM curves were based on 2007, 2008 data. Clearly, industry gets better year on year in its energy efficiency and other performance. So there's planned to be an improvement in BM factors with potentially some variation for sectors that are especially good performing or poor performing. But this is these are proposals, so there'll be lots of arguments. Some industry will say, we need to start from scratch, we need to do a new BM curve. You know, other sectors will want simplicity. This is a trade-off between administrative burden and accuracy. And I think it's also good to know that really it's not about technological achievement, it's about distribution of allowances and sharing and thinking about the distributional cost effects. So, as I mentioned, the cross-sectoral correction factor, you'll realize that this is not necessarily what industry gets in the end. So, the other change is that, I guess, the original design of ETS was very much ex ante, so make no changes, do your design based on historical data. That gives the advantage of certainty, a clear price signal, simplicity. It means that you don't change things very often, but gradually there are more kind of ex-post adjustments being made. So I think one sensible adjustment is for production level increases and decreases. So one of the problems for the historical activity level is that as you go through economic cycles, if it's set in a period of high economic production, it creates a risk of over-allocation. So we've got some of those sort of improvements built in. But clearly there's quite a trade-off between, if you have too many adjustments and corrections, then you might have a more flexible instrument, but it might reduce the efficiency of the policy because industry is never sure what's going to happen because every week there's a change, and it's the same with the MSR design. If you set a very, very flexible and responsive policy, it becomes difficult to predict how it will perform. So there's some important trade-offs to consider, and the modeling experts can help to assess the efficient, optimal solutions. So the cross-sectoral correction factor is one element that industry really dislikes intensely, because effectively what this is that if you imagine you've got a top-down cap and a bottom-up allocation process, where the bottom-up allocation exceeds the top-down limit, there needs to be a correction to ensure that the cap is complied with. So the problem has been that bottom-up allocation has, for different reasons, been too generous, and it's created a requirement to reduce all of the allocations by around 12% on average. So if you're if you're a very advanced production company in the top 10% of performance, you still will get 12% less than your needs because of this cross-sectoral correction factor. So one of the reasons that this has been necessary is that too many sectors have been getting 100% free allocation, and the carbon leakage rules have basically, as I move on to this slide here, well over 90% of sectors qualify for 100% free allocation. So the evidence that we found in the EU, if we skip back, is that there's been no real evidence in the literature that carbon leakage takes place. It might simply be because we've got low carbon price, but certainly there's a good ability of industry to pass through costs into their final product prices. It might be in future that, you know, as the carbon price increases, this could be more of a risk, but equally counteracting that is as we heard earlier, the rapid evolution of ETSs tends to level the playing field. So, so one of probably the EU's industry's number one favorite topic is carbon leakage, and there's huge volumes of hundreds of literature references, and there's some interesting references you can see on the DG Klima website about cost pass-through percentages. So basically, the proposals are to make it much more targeted, and for example, many sectors qualified simply for high trade intensity, but the evidence is that that's not necessarily a very good indicator. So the proposal is to change the definition of the carbon leakage groups and also take out the current metric of carbon cost is obviously requires an assumption on the carbon price, whereas now that's being stripped out and it's a carbon intensity. So moving on to kind of assessing how policy is actually having an effect. So this is, there's a few slides on a study that we did for European Commission to assess whether it was the recession that reduced GHG emissions in EU or was it climate policy. If it was climate policy, which policy had an effect and how much did it have an effect? So this slide is beyond ETS. It's all, the study went beyond ETS, and the policies that are driving the emissions are all policies affecting these sectors. But what this represents is a decomposition analysis of EU industry sectors. These are summarized results, but effectively we used a five-factor decomposition approach, which breaks down GHG trends into structural effects. So, for example, industry moving from one country to another country like Germany to Poland, thinking that it's cheaper to produce. Activity effects linked to GDP growth. Emissions, energy efficiency effects linked to technological progress. Low carbon intensity linked to the uptake of renewable fuels. And GHG abatement linked to uptake of GHG abatement measures. So basically all of these charts at the high level show the same story, which is that production has been increasing with a blip in the economic recession for most sectors in around 2009. You can see on here, this is the blue line at the top, and then the CO2 intensity index, the yellow line at the bottom, has gradually been decreasing right the way from 1995 up to 2012, which was the latest year of this data set. So the major driver for this has been technological progress, so more energy efficiency of industry, not so much on renewable energy, but it's a very useful analysis, and the database we used has got 35 sectors, multiple countries, including South Korea. So we did South Korea in the chart. The trouble with this is it only tells you part of the story, because it doesn't tell you what are the policies that are creating the reduction in the intensity effect. So what we then did was an econometric analysis to try and unpick what was the role of the EU ETS in achieving these reductions. So the methodology we used was to, I guess, draw, we know the reality, we know actual emissions, but we needed to understand the counterfactual emissions of the ETS sectors without the effect of the ETS. So effectively we used econometric analysis to look at the relationships between greenhouse gas emissions and production and energy prices and other macroeconomic energy and technical factors, and then plot the difference between the counterfactual and the actual, and that shows the contribution EU ETS has made. So despite pretty low carbon prices, we found that on average from 2005, from phase 1 and phase 2, there's about 7% reduction in emissions. So at the high level, the ETS is guaranteed to achieve its emissions target because it's cap and trade. The contribution that the ETS itself makes to that is the harder thing to understand because it's driven by multiple policies. But there are tools that we've been using which help to try and unpick that. And I think that's going to be interesting in South Korea too, to understand to what extent is the ETS a driver versus renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc. And then another important element, partly as a function of the low carbon price, is trying to stimulate low carbon transition. So there's been quite a lot of work on funding mechanisms. So For example, we have a modernization fund which provides 310 million allowances to modernize energy systems in less developed member states. The innovation fund is an expansion of the NER 300, so this generates 450 million allowances to support not only CCS and advanced renewables, but also low carbon technology in industry. And then we have auctioning. In phase 3, we expect about 57% auctioned allowances. It's very significant, and that's generating per annum about 3.6 billion euros, which is used by the member states for domestic and international low carbon action. So the final slide, the main lessons are that EU ETS has been successfully implemented. It's gone through a number of iterations and reviews, so naturally you expect it to get refined in time. There's still scope for optimization. Market stability reserve is an important element of that. Improvement of the free allocation and carbon leakage rules to address competitiveness issues for industry is important too. And then funding for low carbon action is also important. And that's particularly interesting for industry that wants to help have money for R&D to make for breakthrough technologies. Certainly simplicity is a key lesson. I think there are some elements of EU ETS that are too complicated, thousands of pages of guidance, but there has been a drive for simplicity at each review stage. So it's a trade-off between a compromise negotiation between the policymakers and industry. Sometimes policymakers don't get it all their way. Predictability, very important, so that industry can invest for the long term. Harmonization, critically important to avoid competitive distortions. Also, stakeholder engagement has been we sometimes get asked, well, what did the EU do about the problem handling process with complaints from industry and lawsuits? EU ETS has had a relatively small number of lawsuits and mostly unsuccessful because policy was developed with industry, and that encourages transparency. It brings in expertise of industry, industry has more expertise in certain topics than policymakers, so it's important to bring industry into the mix. Learning by doing, and it works at the simple level. The cap is guaranteed to be achieved, the emissions reductions will be achieved subject to avoiding carbon leakage, leakage outside the system, and ensuring the MRV system is robust. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an update. I'm happy to share more references as well if you want to see the evaluation report or the impact assessment report. There's lots of research available, so you can get more detail if you want to. Just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elisir Leach, for your wonderful presentation.